Okay, well this is a video I'm quite looking forward to making actually, because it's a subject that I've talked about with people for quite a number of times, but I've never made a video on it, and it's this subject of philosophy versus science. I've seen it discussed a number of times, people wading in on this with videos on YouTube recently. Also the Magic Sandwich Show, I was listening to a recording of some of that, they were talking about that the other week. I want to comment on part of that a little bit later. There's quite a bit of stuff to get through here, so I'm going to try and crack on with it. It's often framed, sometimes framed, erroneously framed, as a kind of empirical evidence versus logical deduction. You know, if you've got a logical argument that points one way and the empirical evidence points the other way, which one should we go for? I don't think there's any doubt about that. We are empirical creatures. We would go for the empirical evidence, and I think there are some fields where that's happened. What we thought would be, what doesn't seem to logically make sense, things like special relativity, quantum mechanics, there are ideas there that don't seem to logically make sense, but we go, once the evidence is strong enough, we go with the evidence. But philosophy versus science isn't about that. But there have been these videos recently, mainly people from a scientific perspective disparaging philosophy, and it kind of, you know, that's the position that I was perhaps in when I started on YouTube 4 years ago. But I've grown, I've developed, I've altered on YouTube, and my feelings towards philosophy have mellowed in that time. Perhaps something fundamental to say is that people are lining up as kind of scientists and philosophers, and debates are, well, you're a philosopher, so what do you think about this? Justify philosophy. You're a scientist, do you have any time for philosophy? But it's wrong. Some people might be professional scientists, some people might be professional philosophers, but I've never met a single person in my life who isn't both a scientist and a philosopher. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the video, certainly with regard to everybody being a scientist. I think perhaps everybody being a philosopher we've got to get into now, perhaps with the first point, because I want to promote, make an argument for where philosophy is useful. And one of the first things to say is that philosophy is a lot more widespread, it's a lot more ubiquitous than just the ivory tower, hallowed halls philosophy of a university philosophy department. Most of the discussions that we have involve philosophy, at least as one element. Maybe we're having a discussion about football, association football, soccer, and we're discussing the way the way the Spanish team and the Barcelona team, their tiki-taka passing style, that's the way football should be made. That's a philosophical position on the way football should be made. When Parliament talks about what tax rate to set, sure, there are some empirical devices within the argument that's made there. You're going to set a tax rate that people can afford to pay. You need to see how much revenue you generate. But there are also ethical considerations. What's a fair tax rate to ask people to pay? And you know, how should we balance it? If you earn double, should you pay double? Should everybody pay the same? If you earn double, as most countries have a system, if you earn double, you'll probably end up paying more than double. But there's a philosophical element to most of these things. So this is why I say everybody is a philosopher, because virtually whatever you're interested in, whatever you're discussing, there are going to be philosophical questions that open up. But there are two specific areas where I think philosophy is very useful that I want to talk about. The first of these is that there are many situations, there are many aspects of our life where science just doesn't seem to touch upon very well. One of these is the subjects of ethics, of morals, and of moral dilemmas. Now, this is where we touch upon what was talked about in the Magic Sandwich Show, because Thunderfoot made this point. Well, if we knew enough about the system, then we would be able to arrive at this. Science would be able to arrive at these things. Well, even if that were true, the fact is we don't know enough about the system, so what are we supposed to do in the meantime? Are we supposed to twiddle our thumbs, scratch our asses and just never arrive at a decision? Or are we going to accept philosophy even if philosophy was second best, given that it'll probably still be the best thing that we have, perhaps for the next 10,000 years to deal with some of these things? Perhaps, you know, even if it isn't quite as good as a scientific approach would be, if it could be, If it's the best we've got, then it's the best that we can use. But when you think about some of these things, such as moral dilemmas, how would you actually go about applying science? Let's say the moral dilemma was this, that you'd shown me up in front of all my friends and family, terribly embarrassed me, absolutely terribly. I was totally mortified and not mentally quite, mentally furious that you've done it, and I punched you on the nose. Is that morally justified, what I've done? And how would you rate the two actions, what you did to me, the kind of mental wrong, the mental anguish you'd hurt me, and the physical anguish I'd hurt you? How would you equate those two things? That would be the first question. And would one of them justify the other as a response? We all have our feelings on that, but how would Thunderfoot go about describing that as a scientist and arriving at an answer? Well, one way you could do it, the only way that I think you could do it, would be if you could model all our brains. If you could perfectly simulate a brain with all the neurons and the neural connections, then perhaps you could do it, and scientifically you could arrive at an answer. But how would you know when you got the right answer? Whenever you adopt any scientific approach, you need some kind of datum, because you need to calibrate. Because we never get things right the first time. We fuck up a dozen times, don't we? And gradually we hone our system in on the right answer. So you need some way of calibrating. So how are you going to calibrate this simulation that you've made? Well, you're going to calibrate it by referring back to people's actual moral positions using their brain. So you simulate somebody's brain, and then you correlate the answer you're getting with what their actual brain is giving, and when you get to the right answer, you're there. The problem then is the gold standard becomes the answer that we were philosophically deriving within our brain anyway. So you're only back to square one. You've not come up with anything better than the philosophically derived feelings that we have with regard to the morality within that dilemma. You've not come up with anything better than that. I don't think that science has trumped philosophy. All it's managed to do is mirror it. So I would be interested in questions like that, how science would trump philosophy in areas where it's our feelings that are most important in the first event. That's the first thing. The second thing where I think philosophy is very important, look, science is brilliant at giving us answers. It's brilliant at finding out which one of the possible answers is the right answer. Science is great with answers. But where I've come to love philosophy is that philosophy is very good, I think, at scoping out the question. What is the question that you're asking? Why are we trying to ask it? And what are the possibilities? Where should science be looking? If science is looking for an answer, what kind of avenues should it go down? That's where philosophy is good, and where most branches of science at some stage have to take place. Even if you think about Charles Darwin and evolution, which is a scientific theory, he thought about that philosophically to look at the kind of avenues. What was the problem he was looking to solve? Why was he looking to solve it? And what kind of avenues should he look down, and what kind of methodology should he approach to do that? And then the science kicks in afterwards. So I think the two things actually live together and complement each other very well. I think one of the reasons that people who favour science don't like philosophy is they see philosophy, and certain people, especially from a religious persuasion, using it as a big stick to beat them with, because they have this kind of idea that philosophy underpins science. This science that you love, if it wasn't for the philosophical underpinning, all your science would fall down anyway. You'd have no reason to believe any of these things. And that's a really interesting thing. It's one of these arguments that I think's kind of made in a vacuum. If we just assume that we're created as we are, in some ways I can see some relevance to that. But we're not created in a vacuum. I've already said that I think we're all philosophers. I also said that I think we're all scientists, and I haven't justified that yet. What is science? Well, I maintain that one way of looking at science is it's something that we all do, and something that we long did before we created the kind of methodological process that is formal science. I'm not saying we're all formal scientists, but we all do the same things. And all that the formal process of science is the methodological run-through of those things that we were already doing. But not just things that we do, things that my pet cat does, things that most sentient life does. So what does my cat do? Let me try and explain. This is an example I've given a few times before. If you were to meet my cat, it's quite a shy cat, my cat, it would be a little bit wary of you. And if the first time you met it, you gave it some food, it would be a little bit less wary of you, but it would still be wary. If on the next 2 or 3 occasions, each time you gave it some food, it would gain in confidence every single time. The same thing would be true if the first time you met it, you kicked it in the slats. It would be more wary of you. If you kicked it in the slats repeatedly, it would become more and more wary. So what is the cat doing? The cat is making an observation. And she's weighting that observation. She's looking at what happens. There's a situation, something happens, there's an outcome. If there's more than one observation and the same outcome happens every time, then she weights she weights the evidence higher because there's multiple observations. And then what she does, she interpolates and extrapolates the evidence that she's collated to predict future responses. Are you liable to be violent to her, or are you liable to be kind to her? So aren't these things the basis of what we do when we do science? We take observations. We're not happy with one observation. We want multiple observations. If over multiple observations we see some kind of a pattern, then we regard that there's probably some kind of a relationship between the input and the output, or between a couple of inputs. We base the solidity of that relationship based on the number of observations and the types of outputs that we're getting, and then we interpolate and extrapolate from that. It's the same thing, it's just that we've formalised the structure of it. Now this is really good. I think, why the fuck is he telling me all of this? Because this is all kind of bollocks, really. Why do we need to go through all of this? And this is the thing, is that we have this idea, some philosophers come out with this idea that philosophy underpins science, that without philosophy there's no underpinning, there's no way, there's nothing for science to base itself on. But here's the thing, we were doing science long before we were doing philosophy. I don't think in any way my cat thinks philosophically about anything, even subconsciously, but she does think scientifically about things, albeit perhaps subconsciously. And at root, whether you're talking about science or whether you're talking about philosophy, you have to make some assumptions. You can only go so far back, and then you have to make some assumptions. Assumptions which are often said to be self-evident truths. These are things in philosophy. There's certain statements which we take on board because they appear to be self-evidently true. But why do they appear to be self-evidently true? Well, the point is they appear to be self-evidently true because of our empirical observations of them show that they are never falsified. But those empirical observations are not just observations we make, they're observations that we instinctively expect because we've evolved to expect them. They're instinctive observations that our ancestors made, and not just our human ancestors, but our pre-human ancestors. Not just our ape ancestors or our monkey ancestors, but our ancestors a long time before that. So perhaps in a way science is indebted and bedded on philosophy to a level, but at the same stage the basis of a philosophy is indebted to maybe not formalised science, but that kind of empirical evidence that's given us this instinctive expectation of things that are self-evident in the first place. So it seems that there's kind of a circular relationship. Both of them support one another, and that this idea that really, you know, if you have a scientific persuasion, then you're basing it on philosophy. It's a great argument if you don't take into account the fact that we're evolved beings. But if you do take that into account, and you really should, I don't think the relationship is quite as simple as some people maintain. Well, I'm really interested. I'm sure some people will disagree with some of what I've said in this. I do hope so. Thank you for watching this video, and I'm interested in what you've got to say. Bye for now.